She didn't say hello. She didn't offer water or shade. She just stood in the doorway of a dying ranch, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "I don't need another ranch hand. I need a husband." He had ridden 300 miles looking for work. He found something he never expected, a woman fighting alone against men who wanted everything she owned, a piece of land soaked in blood and stubbornness, and a choice that would either destroy him or finally give him a reason to stay. This is their story. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. And if stories like this move something in you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. The horse smelled water before Silas did. That was always the way of it. The animal's instincts sharper, more honest, less clouded by whatever weight a man dragged behind him on the road. Silas let the roan mare have her head, and she angled left off the trail toward a cluster of cottonwood trees where a stock tank sat low and muddy at the edge of someone's property line. He didn't know whose land this was. He didn't know much of anything about this part of Texas, which was partly why he'd come. New territory, new faces, maybe new luck, though Silas Boone had long since stopped believing luck was something a man could find by simply riding far enough from where things went wrong. He was 29 years old and had worked 11 different ranches in 8 years. Not because he was troublesome, he wasn't, mostly, but because nothing had ever asked him to stay. He'd ride in, do the work, get paid, and eventually the season would end, or the outfit would trim down, or the owner's nephew would show up needing a job. And Silas would be back on the road with his saddle and his bedroll and that particular kind of quiet that settles into a man who's never had a fixed address. He let the mare drink, pulled his hat off, and looked out across the land stretching south. It was good country, even struggling the way it was. The grass had taken a beating from the dry summer. He could see that from the color of it, more yellow than it should be in October. But the bones of the land were solid. Rolling hills, decent drainage, a creek line threading through the middle distance like a vein of something valuable. Somebody owned this, and whoever it was had either the good fortune or the poor sense to be sitting on something worth fighting over. He put his hat back on and followed the fence line east, looking for a gate or a road that might lead to a main house where he could ask about work. What he found instead was a woman on her knees in the dirt, wrestling with a section of collapsed fence post. She was maybe 5 feet and 4 inches of concentrated irritation. Dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. A work shirt rolled to the elbows, canvas trousers tucked into boots that had dried mud caked halfway up the ankle. She was trying to lever the post back upright using nothing but a length of iron rod, and apparently the force of her own stubbornness, which seemed considerable. The post wasn't cooperating. Silas reined in the mare, watched for a moment, then swung down without being asked. He looped the reins over the nearby fence wire, walked over, and put both hands on the post above hers. "Other side," he said. "The ground's soft on the west face. Push east while you leave her." She looked up at him. Sharp eyes, brown, no warmth in them, but no fear either. Then without saying a word, she adjusted her grip and shoved east. Silas levered. The post groaned, shifted, and dropped back into its hole with a satisfying thunk. "Needs packing," Silas said. "I know what it needs," she said, already reaching for the loose dirt with her bare hands. He helped anyway. They worked without speaking for about 3 minutes, tamping dirt and gravel around the base until the post stood straight. When it was done, she stood up, brushed her hands on her trousers, and looked at him the way a person looks at someone they're trying to take the full measure of in limited time. "You looking for work?" she asked. "I am." "What kind?" "Whatever's honest." She tilted her head slightly, like that answer was either refreshing or suspicious, and she hadn't decided which. "You have a name?" "Silas Boone. Out of the Panhandle most recently." "Most recently," she repeated, and there was something in her voice, not mockery exactly, just an awareness that the phrase carried a history. "Come up to the house. I have coffee, and something I need to say before you decide whether you want to work here." He followed her up a worn dirt path toward a 2-story farmhouse that had been painted white sometime in the past decade and not since. The porch boards flexed under weight, but held. A barn sat behind the house in reasonable shape. There were cattle in the south pasture. He could see them from here, maybe 60 head, though it was hard to tell from this distance. A bunkhouse to the left of the barn had one window boarded over. She poured 2 tin cups of coffee from a pot on the wood stove and set his on the kitchen table without ceremony. Silas sat down. The chair was solid. The table was older than the house, he suspected. Thick-cut pine, worn smooth by years of meals and elbows and probably a few arguments. She remained standing. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him over the rim. "I'm going to say something straight," she said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything back." "All right. My name is Evelyn Mercer. My husband, Robert, died 14 months ago. Kicked by a horse. Stupid accident, the kind that shouldn't kill a man but did. He left me this ranch, about 340 acres, roughly 80 head of cattle when I started, now down to 62 because I've had a bad year, and a debt to the Territorial Bank in Haskell that comes due in full at the end of March." She paused. He said nothing. She continued. "Under Texas property law as it currently stands, a widow has limited legal standing to defend a land title when that title is challenged by a third party with better lawyers and more patience than she has money. I have had 2 men come to this door in the past 6 months telling me they represent interests who believe my eastern pastures, about 90 acres, belongs to a survey line that was drawn incorrectly in 1871. I believe they're wrong. I cannot prove it yet, and the man behind those visits has enough money to make the wrong thing look right for long enough to take the land before I can stop him." Silas turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Who's the man?" "His name is Clifton Voss. He owns the Running V operation about 12 miles east. He's been waiting for Robert to die for years. He just didn't expect it to take this particular shape." Something crossed her face. Not grief exactly, more like the recognition that she'd been handed a situation she hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. Robert's death gave Voss his opening, and he is not a man who wastes openings. "All right," Silas said. "So you need a good lawyer." "I need a husband." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods and something shifted in the barn. A horse resettling, maybe? Silas set down his coffee cup. "Mrs. Mercer, hear me out," she said, and her voice was steady, not desperate. That was the thing that caught him. There was no desperation in her, just the flat, clear reasoning of someone who had already worked through all the other options and found them insufficient. A married woman with an established husband on the property presents a different legal target than a widow alone. It changes the standing on land claims. It changes how the bank looks at debt repayment. It changes, she exhaled through her nose, how men like Voss calculate their odds. "You're proposing a practical arrangement." "Yes." She met his eyes directly. "You would have room and board, wages equal to what a top hand makes in this county, full use of the equipment and horses for your work here, and legal standing as co-holder of this property. In return, I need a man whose name goes on the paperwork, who shows up in town as my husband, who works this ranch as his own, and who doesn't," she paused carefully, "expect things from this marriage that are not being offered." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this for a while." 3 months, she said. "I have thought about very little else. And you're offering this to a man you just met in a field. You fixed my fence post without being asked," she said, "and you didn't talk while you did it. That tells me something." He almost laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because of how much weight she was placing on such a small thing. And yet, he understood it. A man who talks too much while he's working is usually working for the audience, not the fence. "I could be a terrible person," Silas said. "You don't know me. I know you came from the Panhandle and you're here looking for honest work, which means you've been on the road long enough to be tired but not long enough to be broken. I know you're not drunk. I know you didn't look at me the way some men look." She said it plainly, without bitterness, just as fact. "I've had 3 men come through here in the past 2 months looking for work. 2 of them looked at me like I was part of the problem they were hoping to inherit along with the job. The 3rd one was respectful enough but kept asking about the deed. You asked about the fence post." Silas stared at the table for a while. He thought about 11 ranches. He thought about the road west of here and the road east, and how every road he'd ever been on eventually forked into another road he didn't remember choosing. He thought about what she'd said, practical arrangement, and turned the phrase over in his mind like a stone you might find in a riverbed, looking to see what was underneath it. If I say yes, he said slowly, what happens if it doesn't work? If the bank takes the land anyway, or Voss finds some other angle? Then we part ways with nothing owed between us, and you ride on with wages for whatever time you've worked. The arrangement dissolves if the ranch fails. Her chin lifted slightly. But I don't intend to fail. The way she said it, not with bravado, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had made their decision and was done negotiating with fate, settled something in his chest he couldn't quite name. I'd need to understand the full shape of the debt, he said. I have the ledger books. And I'd want to see whatever those men put in writing when they came about the eastern pasture. I have those letters too. He nodded slowly. I'll want to walk the property tomorrow. All of it, including the eastern boundary. Evelyn Mercer studied him for a moment, and for the first time since he'd walked into her kitchen, something in her expression shifted. Not quite softness, but a kind of careful recalibration. You're saying yes, she said. I'm saying I'll look at what you've got and I'll give you an honest answer by morning. That's what I'm saying. That's more than I expected today, she said. And there was something behind the words that he didn't try to decode. She showed him to the bunkhouse, pointed out which bunk was cleanest, and told him supper was at 6:30 if he wanted it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't make promises. She just walked back to the house with the same matter-of-fact stride she'd had out in the field, and he watched the screen door swing shut behind her. He sat down on the bunk and looked at the boarded-up window across from him. He had ridden 300 miles looking for work. He had found something considerably more complicated. He said yes in the morning. They rode the property line together, all 340 acres, and she answered every question he put to her without hedging. The cattle were in fair condition, not great. The equipment needed maintenance but was functional. The main house roof had a soft spot on the north side. The creek that cut through the middle third of the property had run low in the summer but recovered well and would carry through winter. When they reached the eastern boundary, she stopped the horse and pointed to where the fence line made a slight jog south. Robert always said the line should run straight from that rock formation up there to the creek bend. The survey map shows it bending south right here, which cuts off about 90 acres from what he believed we owned. She looked at the land ahead of them. Good grass, well watered, sitting on a gentle slope that would protect cattle in bad weather. Voss wants that 90 acres. He's been patient about it. Now he thinks his patience is about to pay off. Silas looked at the ground. He looked at the rock formation she'd pointed to. He looked at the way the fence jogged. He didn't say anything yet. He filed it away. They were married 4 days later in the office of a justice of the peace in the town of Caldwell Crossing, which was the nearest place that had one. The ceremony took 6 minutes. 2 strangers off the street served as witnesses. Evelyn signed the registry with a steady hand. Silas signed below her name. On the ride back, they didn't speak for the first several miles. The horses moved easily in the October air, the sky wide and pale blue above them, and the silence between two people who had just made an enormous and uncertain decision lay over everything like the first frost. Present, undeniable, not yet fully felt. Finally, she said, "The town will talk. Towns always do. It'll get back to Voss." "Good," Silas said. "Let it." She glanced at him sideways, quick, assessing. Then she faced forward again, and he thought maybe the corner of her mouth moved. He wasn't sure. The brim of her hat was in the way. When they got back to the ranch, there was work to do. The south pasture gate had a broken hinge. The water trough near the barn had a slow leak. 3 fence posts on the west line needed resetting. Silas unsaddled his horse, changed his coat, picked up a set of tools, and got to work. He didn't think about what he'd just agreed to. He thought about the fence posts, and the way the afternoon light was falling, and whether he could get 2 of the 3 done before dark. He thought about the eastern boundary and the way the fence jogged south. And somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet as water moving under ice, something began to move. An instinct, a certainty, the particular feeling a man gets when he looks at a crooked thing and knows it wasn't always that way. He set the first post, tamped the dirt, moved to the second. The sun dropped. The cattle moved in the south pasture, their breath fogging the cooling air. Inside the main house, through the kitchen window, he could see the lamplight go on. He worked until dark. The first week of their marriage, they barely spoke at meals. Not out of hostility. There was none of that, at least not yet. It was more the particular awkwardness of two private people suddenly sharing a kitchen table, a water pump, a property line, and a legal name without having shared anything else first. They passed the salt. They discussed the cattle. They talked about the gate on the south pasture and whether it needed a new hinge pin or a whole new gate assembly. Practical things. Safe things. The kind of conversation that fills space without requiring either person to reveal anything they weren't ready to give. Silas ate quickly and got back to work. Evelyn cleared the plates and returned to her ledger books. That was the shape of their evenings for the first several days, and neither of them seemed to find it particularly uncomfortable, which was perhaps the first sign that this arrangement had been made between two people who understood, at least, what they were. He slept in the bunkhouse. She hadn't offered the spare room in the main house, and he hadn't asked. The bunkhouse was dry and the wood stove drew well enough. He'd slept in worse places by a considerable margin. What he spent the evenings doing, after the tools were put away and the horses checked and the chores that multiply endlessly on any working ranch were as done as they were going to get that day, was reading Robert Mercer's ledger books. Evelyn had handed them over without comment, 4 of them, thick cloth-covered volumes going back 11 years. Robert had been a meticulous record keeper, which was either a virtue or a compulsion depending on how you looked at it, and the books showed everything: cattle counts, water levels, seasonal expenses, grazing rotations, and a dozen years of notes in a cramped but readable hand about the condition of the land. Silas wasn't looking for anything in particular when he started. He was just trying to understand the shape of the operation he'd stepped into. But somewhere around the third night, deep in a volume from 1879, he found a passage that made him stop and read it twice. Eastern pasture line queried again by Halloran survey crew. They maintain the jog at the boulder field is correct per the 1871 federal mark, but cannot produce the original chain measurements. R says the line ran straight in his father's time, and the jog appeared after the Voss acquisition of the adjacent section. Worth pressing. Silas sat with that for a while. Then he turned back several pages, looking for earlier mentions, and found them. A thread of notes running through 1878 and 1879, Robert Mercer quietly documenting his suspicion that the eastern boundary had been altered, or at least that the recorded survey didn't match the physical reality of what his family had always considered their land. He found a second entry from 1880, wrote to the land office in Austin. No response yet. Halloran outfit packed up and left the county. Voss bought the Jennings place to the north. He's surrounding us on 2 sides now. I don't like it. And then, nothing. The entries about the eastern line simply stopped. Whether Robert had given up the inquiry or had simply moved on to more pressing concerns, the ledger didn't say. Silas closed the book and looked at the boarded window in the bunkhouse wall. The next morning, before Evelyn was up, he walked the eastern boundary again by himself. Just him and the early light and the cold that had been building since late October. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives and takes up residence like an unwanted guest who knows you can't make him leave. He walked slowly. He looked at the ground, at the way the soil changed color near the boulder field she'd pointed out, at the old post holes that had been filled in, at the rock formations that sat in the landscape like landmarks that didn't care what any map said about them. He crouched at the point where the fence line jogged south and put his hand flat on the ground. The soil here was darker than on either side of it, disturbed at some point, then settled. Could be nothing. Could be old drainage work. Could be something else entirely. He stood up, looked north toward the boulder formation, then south toward the creek bend. If the line ran straight, if it had always run straight, the way Robert's notes suggested, then the jog didn't correct an error. It created one. He didn't say any of this to Evelyn yet. He wasn't sure enough, and he had a strong instinct against speaking before he knew what he was talking about. What he did instead was ride into Caldwell Crossing the following Saturday on the pretense of picking up supplies, and while he was there he asked the man at the feed store, carefully, conversationally, the way you ask things when you don't want it getting back to anyone, whether there was an independent surveyor operating in the county or near it. The feed store man thought about it. Fella named Pruitt works out of Abilene. Does property work for private parties. Good reputation, from what I hear. That right, Silas said, and let the subject drop. He bought flour and lamp oil and a coil of new fence wire, loaded it on the pack horse, and rode back to the ranch. He didn't mention Pruitt to Evelyn. He wrote a letter that evening and posted it the next time he was in town, addressed to one E. Pruitt, surveyor, care of the Abilene Land Office. He wasn't hiding it from her exactly. He just wasn't ready to raise her hopes on something that might amount to nothing, and he had a feeling that Evelyn Mercer's hopes were something she kept under careful guard, not something she'd thank him for disturbing without good reason. It was around this time that Clifton Voss made his first direct move. Silas had heard the name spoken in town often enough to have assembled a picture of the man before he ever laid eyes on him. Voss was somewhere north of 50, had come into the territory in the early 1870s with enough money to buy what he wanted and enough patience to wait for what he couldn't yet afford. He ran the running V on about 800 acres to the east, had a reputation for operating close to the line of what was legal and occasionally stepping over it in ways that were difficult to prove, and was known to have a lawyer in Abilene on permanent retainer. People in Caldwell Crossing spoke about him the way people speak about weather that hasn't arrived yet, with a kind of resigned awareness that it was coming and would be unpleasant when it did. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, riding a gray horse that cost more than most men made in a year, accompanied by a younger man who stayed back near the gate and didn't speak. Silas was replacing boards on the barn's south wall when he heard the horses. He set down his hammer and walked around to the front of the barn. Evelyn had already come out onto the porch. Voss tipped his hat to her. He was a broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with a square face and pale eyes that had the quality of being very still while the rest of him moved. He smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how a conversation ends. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Then he looked at Silas with an expression that was carefully neutral. "I heard you'd remarried. Couldn't say I blame you. Place like this needs a man to manage it." Silas watched Evelyn's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He came to stand beside her at the porch steps, not in front of her, just beside her. There was a difference. "Mr. Voss," Evelyn said, "I don't recall inviting you." "Neighbors don't always need invitations." Voss leaned on his saddle horn with an ease that was just slightly too deliberate. "I wanted to come pay my respects to your new husband, and to say that my offer still stands, the one I made to you back in August. $1,500 for the eastern section. It's a fair price for disputed land." "It's not disputed," Silas said. It was the first thing he'd said, and he said it quietly, the way you state something obvious. Voss looked at him with mild interest, as though he'd forgotten Silas was there. "You've been here, 3 weeks?" "About that." "Then you may not know the full history of the boundary question. It's complex, goes back to the original survey. My legal team has been looking at it quite carefully." "I'm sure they have," Silas said. The two men looked at each other. Voss's pale eyes moved over Silas the way a man assesses livestock, not with contempt exactly, but with calculation, measuring what he was dealing with. "The offer is time-limited," Voss said finally, still looking at Silas rather than Evelyn, which was itself a kind of message. "Winter makes legal proceedings difficult for everyone. I'd hate to see this drag into a lengthy process that costs more than the land is worth to either party." "Then we agree on something," Silas said. "We'd hate that too. You have a safe ride back, Mr. Voss." There was a beat of silence, then Voss smiled, a real smile this time, the one that didn't reach his eyes, and wheeled the gray horse toward the gate. The younger man fell in behind him. They rode back down the lane without looking back. Evelyn let out a slow breath. "He's never come himself before," she said. "He always sent the lawyers." "He wanted to look at me." "And?" Silas picked his hammer back up. "He's not sure yet what he's dealing with. That's good." He paused at the corner of the barn. "Don't let it show that it worried you. If anyone in town asks, he came to welcome me to the county, and you offered him coffee." She looked at him for a moment. "You think he has people in town?" "Man like that always has people in town." She nodded slowly, and something in the way she did it, the careful, measuring quality of it, told him she was revising her assessment of the man she'd married. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way you adjust your footing when the ground shifts a quarter inch under you and you want to stay upright. "All right," she said. "Coffee." He went back to the barn wall. She went back inside. The afternoon resumed its ordinary shape. But that night at supper, something was different. He wasn't sure what exactly. She put the food on the table the same way, sat in the same chair, poured coffee with the same efficient motion. But the silence between them had changed quality, the way silence does when the people sharing it have been through something together and come out the other side still standing. "Robert's ledger books," he said without preface. "The 1879 volume. There are entries about the eastern boundary. He had questions about the survey jog that he never finished following up on." She set her cup down carefully. "I know about those entries." "You read them?" "After he died, I read everything." She looked at the table for a moment. "I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have money for a surveyor, and even if I had, a widow trying to challenge a boundary survey up against Voss and his Abilene lawyer." She lifted her eyes to his. "Who is going to listen?" "The land office might listen if the evidence is solid enough." "Do you think there's evidence?" He considered telling her about the letter to Pruitt. He considered the way her face had gone careful and controlled, the way it always did when she was keeping something in. He thought about what she'd said at the kitchen table on the day he arrived. "I don't intend to fail," and the quiet ferocity behind it. "I think the ground near the boulder field has been disturbed," he said. "I think Robert was right that the line ran straight in his father's time, and I think Voss didn't come here today to welcome me to the county." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "I've written to a surveyor in Abilene, independent, good reputation. I want him to walk that boundary before I say anything more definite about what I think happened there." She was quiet for a moment. "You did that without telling me." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't want to be wrong out loud," he said. "Not about something this important to you." The kitchen was still. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. A north wind, carrying the smell of something colder coming down from the plains. November in this part of Texas could be mild or it could be brutal, and the air tonight had the feel of the latter kind building at the edges. Evelyn looked at him across the table. Not the way she'd looked at him that first day in the kitchen, when she was measuring him against her need. Something else. Something that hadn't been there before. "You should have told me," she said. "This is my land, my fight." "You're right," he said. "I should have." She seemed slightly thrown by the agreement, as if she'd prepared for an argument and found it unnecessary. "Well," she said, "don't do it again." "I won't." She picked up her coffee. He picked up his, and they sat in something that was, for the first time, not quite so much like the silence of strangers. Pruitt's reply came 12 days later. He was available and would make the ride from Abilene for the standard fee plus expenses. Silas wrote back immediately, told him to come the second week of December, and asked him to arrive before dawn on a Tuesday so as not to be seen riding in from the Caldwell Crossing Road. Evelyn raised an eyebrow when he told her. "You're worried about someone watching the road?" "Voss has been in town more than usual for this time of year. I've heard it from 2 different people without asking." Silas folded Pruitt's letter and tucked it in his coat. "If he sees a surveyor riding onto this property, we lose whatever advantage we have in him not knowing what we're doing." "And what are we doing exactly?" "Making sure we know the truth before anyone else does." She thought about that. "And if the truth is that the survey jog is correct? That the eastern pasture really doesn't belong to us?" He met her eyes. "Then we know it. And we find another way." She didn't ask what another way might look like. Maybe because she didn't want to think about it yet, or maybe because she was starting to trust that he'd figure something out, which was a new feeling for her and one she wasn't entirely comfortable with. Those weeks between Voss's visit and Pruitt's arrival were the strangest of that early period, a time when everything looked ordinary on the surface while underneath it something was building. The way water builds behind a dam, nobody can see yet. Silas worked the ranch with the same steady attention he brought to everything. Repairing, maintaining, planning for winter, pushing the cattle's condition up from fair towards something better. He rode into town only when necessary and kept his conversations light and short. He asked about people he didn't need to know about. He listened more than he talked. Voss's name came up twice in the feed store and once in the small hotel dining room where ranchers sometimes gathered on market days. Both times Silas heard it, the context was the same. Voss had been asking around delicately about the new man out at the Mercer place. Who was he? Where did he come from? What was known about him? Nothing threatening in the questions. Just a powerful man taking inventory of a situation he thought he controlled, making sure nothing had changed in a way that required him to change his plans. Silas filed it away and said nothing about it at home. At home. He noticed when he started thinking of the Mercer ranch that way. Not the property, not the spread, not her place, but home. He wasn't sure when the word had shifted into that meaning in his mind, and he didn't spend a lot of time examining it. He just noticed it the way you notice the days getting shorter, gradually, then all at once. Evelyn, for her part, was doing something he hadn't expected. She was talking to him, not about the ranch or the debt or Voss or any of the practical machinery of the situation they were in, but about Robert sometimes, and about the land as she'd known it growing up, and about what she'd imagined when she'd first come here as a young wife and found herself in love with a piece of ground that was older and more stubborn than either of them. It wasn't sentimental. She didn't dress it up. She'd say things across the supper table in the same matter-of-fact voice she used for everything else. And he'd listen, and sometimes he'd say something back, and sometimes he wouldn't. And neither of them seemed to need the conversation to go anywhere in particular. Robert thought this land could carry 400 head if the eastern pasture stayed ours and the creek held, she said one evening in late November, the wood stove throwing orange light across the kitchen floor. He had plans. He drew them out in one of those books. Volume 2, Silas said, last 30 pages. She looked at him. You read all 4 books. 3 times. Something moved across her face that he couldn't name. He would have liked you, she said. Then she seemed to hear how that sounded, and she looked back at her coffee, and neither of them addressed it. Pruitt arrived before dawn on the second Tuesday of December, as arranged, riding a sturdy bay horse and carrying more equipment than Silas had expected. Measuring chains, a transit level, a set of original Federal Survey records that he'd pulled from the land office in Austin before making the trip. He was a small, precise man of about 55 with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend their working lives paying very close attention to things that don't move. He shook hands with both of them in the kitchen, accepted coffee, and spread his records across the kitchen table. "Show me where the jog is," he said. They took him out at first light, when the air was hard and cold, and their breath came in clouds. Pruitt walked the boundary slowly, consulting his instruments and his records in turn, speaking very little, crouching occasionally to look at something on the ground. When he reached the boulder field, he spent nearly 40 minutes there, measuring angles and distances and muttering quiet numbers to himself that Silas couldn't hear from where he stood. Evelyn stood beside Silas in the cold and didn't say anything. She had her arms crossed, not against him, just against the cold, and he could see in the line of her shoulders the effort it took to stand there quietly and wait. At one point, Pruitt called him over and showed him something through the transit's eyepiece, an alignment of natural features that told a story about where a straight line would have run before the fence was built where it was. "See that?" Pruitt said. "Yes," Silas said. "Original 1871 chain mark should be at the base of the North Boulder. You know what I found at the base of the North Boulder?" "Tell me." "Nothing. The marker's gone." Pruitt straightened up and looked at him over his glasses. "But I found where it was." They didn't get the full report until evening, when Pruitt sat at the kitchen table again with his notes spread before him and Evelyn sitting across from him with her hands flat on the table and her face very still. The original 1871 Federal Survey ran this property line straight, north-northwest from the creek bend to a point at the boulder formation, then continuing to the county road, Pruitt said. The jog that currently exists in the fence line represents a deviation of approximately 91 acres from that original boundary. There is evidence at the boulder field of a former survey marker that has been removed. The current fence line does not match the recorded Federal Survey. Evelyn's hands tightened on the table. Silas watched her. "What does that mean legally?" she asked. Her voice was steady. He didn't know how she kept it that way. "It means the eastern pasture is yours, has always been yours under the original grant." Pruitt looked at her carefully. "Someone moved the survey marker and built the fence line to the wrong coordinates sometime between 1871 and whenever the current fence was put in. I cannot tell you who did it. I can tell you what the original record says and what the ground tells me, and those two things agree with each other, and they disagree with the fence." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the north wind had returned, stronger now than it had been in November, and underneath its sound, Silas could hear the cattle moving in the south pasture, restless in the cold. He looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, nothing as simple as that, but with the particular intensity of a person absorbing something they have wanted to be true for a very long time and are only now allowing themselves to believe. "Can you put that in writing?" she asked Pruitt. "That's what you're paying me for," he said. She looked at Silas then, across the kitchen table, in the orange lamplight, with the north wind at the windows and 91 acres of justice sitting between them like something they dug out of the cold ground with their bare hands. "You were right," she said. Not gratitude exactly, more like acknowledgement, the kind a person offers when they're not used to having someone in their corner and they're trying to figure out what it means that one is standing there. "Robert was right," Silas said. "We just finished what he started." She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at Pruitt's papers, and her voice was all business again, asking about filing procedures and timelines and the land office in Austin, and Silas listened and added what he knew, and between the three of them they began to work out what came next. But later, after Pruitt had been shown to the spare room and the lamp was burning low, and Silas was pulling on his coat to walk back to the bunkhouse, Evelyn said quietly from the kitchen doorway, "Thank you for doing it quietly, for doing it right." He stopped at the door. He looked back at her. "The fence will need to come down and go back up in the right place," he said. "Soon as we have the filing confirmed, we should do it before the worst of winter. Make it a fact on the ground, not just paper." "I know," she said. "It'll take a few days of hard work." "I know that too." He nodded. He went out into the cold, and the door swung shut behind him, and the wind came down off the north plain and hit him full in the face as he walked across the dark yard toward the bunkhouse, carrying something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something in that direction. Something that felt, against all his previous experience, like it might last. Pruitt's written report arrived from Abilene 10 days after his visit, sealed in a brown envelope addressed to both of them, Mr. and Mrs. Silas Boone, which was the first time Silas had seen his name written that way on anything official, and he noticed it without quite meaning to. Evelyn read the report at the kitchen table while Silas stood near the window with his coffee. She read it once through quickly, then went back and read it again slowly, the way she did with anything important, not trusting her first impression, making sure she hadn't wanted something badly enough to read it into the words. When she set it down, she smoothed the pages flat with her palm and looked up. "He's certain," she said. "He wouldn't have put it in writing if he wasn't." She nodded slowly. "I'm going to take this to Austin." "We," Silas said. She looked at him. "We're going to take it to Austin," he said. "Your name's on the deed, mine's on the marriage registry. Together is harder to ignore than either one alone." She considered that for a moment, then picked up the report and set it carefully inside the front cover of Robert's 1879 ledger, the volume where the questions had started, and placed them both on the shelf above the fireplace like a thing being kept safe. "After the fence," she said. "We moved the fence first, then Austin." They spent 3 days in mid-December resetting the eastern boundary. It was cold, bitter work. The ground had hardened enough that driving new posts required twice the effort it would have taken in October, and the old fence wire was rusted and resistant and cut Silas's hands through his gloves twice on the first morning. Evelyn worked beside him without complaint and without pretending it wasn't hard. She didn't have the upper body strength to drive posts cleanly, so she handled the wire, stretching it, stapling it, checking tension, while he drove and tamped, and they fell into a working rhythm that didn't require much talking because they'd already been working alongside each other long enough to read each other's pace. On the second afternoon, while they were stringing the final section of wire along what was now, legally and physically, their correct boundary line, she said without looking up from the pliers in her hand. Robert tried to move this fence himself, the first year after Voss's men put it in the wrong place. What happened? 3 of Voss's hands showed up and told him if he touched it, they'd drive his cattle off the creek access. She pulled the wire taut and locked it around the staple. Robert wasn't a coward, but he had 60 head that needed that water and no one to back him up. He let it go. She moved to the next post. He never quite forgave himself. Silas drove a staple. He documented everything instead, kept the record. That's what Robert did when he couldn't do the thing he wanted. He wrote it down. She glanced at him sideways. I used to find it frustrating. Now I'm grateful. He didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't tip into something neither of them was ready for. He just moved to the next post and kept working, and she did the same. And by the time the light went flat and gray in the late afternoon, they had the last section done and the fence line ran straight, north-northwest from the creek bend to the boulder field, honest and solid, the way it always should have been. Evelyn stood back and looked at it. The cold wind came up from the south and moved her coat against her, and she put both hands in her pockets and stood there for a long moment without speaking. Silas stood beside her. He was tired. His hands hurt where the wire had cut. The back of his neck ached from the posture of the work. 91 acres, she said quietly. Yours, he said. She didn't correct the pronoun, but she turned to look at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Open, briefly unguarded, the way a person looks in an unobserved moment when they aren't managing what shows on their face. Then it was gone, and she picked up the tool bag and started back toward the barn. They rode to Austin the first week of January, a 3-day trip each way, staying at a hotel that charged reasonable rates and asked no questions. The land office was a cold stone building full of clerks who moved slowly and spoke in the particular bureaucratic monotone of men who have seen too many people come through their door with papers they believe will change everything. The clerk who took their filing looked at Pruitt's report, looked at the original 1871 survey record that Pruitt had cross-referenced, looked at the photographs Pruitt had taken of the boulder field and the disturbed ground where the marker had been removed, and said, "This will need to go to the review board 6 to 8 weeks. We'd like to speak with the supervising land commissioner," Silas said pleasantly. "He's very busy." "We'll wait," Evelyn said. They waited 4 hours. When the commissioner finally saw them, a tired-looking man named Aldridge, who seemed to operate at the edge of his patience at all times, he looked at the same documents, asked 3 sharp questions, and told them the review board timeline was standard procedure, but that the documentation appeared thorough, and he would personally flag the file as a priority boundary dispute. "Has Clifton Voss or any representative of the Running V filed anything with this office regarding this boundary?" Silas asked. Aldridge looked at him carefully. "I can't discuss other parties' filings." "That's answer enough," Silas said. They rode back to the ranch through January cold, and if either of them had hoped the trip would settle things cleanly and quickly, those hopes adjusted themselves to the reality that the law moves on its own schedule, regardless of how urgent your situation feels to you personally. What they rode home to was a ranch in the full grip of a deteriorating winter. The temperature had dropped hard during the week they'd been gone, and their nearest neighbor, an older man named Casper Dills, who ran a small operation 2 miles north, had looked in on the cattle for them. But Dills was 71 with bad knees, and there was only so much he could do. 2 calves had been born early and weren't thriving. The water trough in the north pasture had a freeze crack along the bottom seam that was going to get worse before it got better. And the hay supply in the main barn was lower than it should have been. Someone had left the south-facing door open during a wind, and a significant portion of a bale had blown into the mud and been ruined. Silas dealt with all of it in the first 2 days back, methodically, without complaint, because there was no point in complaining about weather, and there was no point in complaining about the particular way that a ranch always finds new ways to need you the moment you turn your back. The early calves he brought into the barn and set up with supplemental feeding. The trough he patched with a tar compound that would hold until he could replace the whole unit in spring. The hay he accounted for in the feed rationing and adjusted accordingly. What he didn't account for, what no one accounted for, was the night of January 14th. He woke at 3 in the morning with the particular kind of alertness that comes not from a sound, but from the absence of one. The wind had stopped. In a Texas winter, when the wind stops suddenly in the middle of the night, it means something is coming, and whatever it is, the air is making room for it. He was out of the bunkhouse and in his boots before he was fully awake, and he stood in the yard in the dead still dark and felt the temperature against his face, already deep below freezing and dropping, and smelled something on the air that was hard to describe, except that it was the smell of a sky about to do something serious. He went to the barn first, checked the early calves, added feed, made sure the latch was solid. Then he walked the perimeter of the house, checking shutters, checking the wood supply stacked against the north wall. That was when he saw the eastern pasture, or rather, he saw the gap where the fence should have been. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at because his mind resisted it. The fence they'd spent 3 days building was down. Not damaged, not blown over, but systematically cut and removed, a section maybe 40 feet wide. The wire rolled and dragged off somewhere in the dark. And through that gap, the cattle, his cattle, their cattle, were moving slowly northward into the disputed territory they'd just legally reclaimed, following some instinct, or perhaps just following the gap, the way cattle do, without any understanding of what a property line means or costs. He didn't stand there long. He went to the house and knocked hard on the door, and when Evelyn opened it, already in her coat, because she had heard his footsteps and was not a woman who waited to be told what was happening, he said, "Fence is down on the east line. Cattle are moving through." Her face went still and sharp in the way it did when she was processing something dangerous. "How many head?" "Can't tell yet. Most of them. We need to move now before—" He stopped. She heard it the same moment he did. A sound from the north, very far away but coming fast. A sound like the whole sky being dragged across the ground, low, sustained, with a vibration underneath it that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. "How long do we have?" she asked. He looked north. The stars in that direction had been swallowed by something absolute. 2 hours. Maybe less. She was already pulling on her gloves. "Then let's go." What followed was the longest 2 hours of Silas Boone's life, and he had spent time in situations that would have qualified for that description by any reasonable measure. They rode into the eastern pasture in the dark with lanterns that the wind kept trying to extinguish, and the cattle were scattered over a larger area than he'd expected, spooked by something, moving in the anxious, directionless way cattle move when they sense incoming weather and can't decide which way to go to escape it. In the dark, with the temperature falling and the sound from the north getting louder and more defined, it took everything both of them had to work the herd back south. Silas lost sight of Evelyn twice. Both times his heart did something unpleasant before he found the light of her lantern again, moving steadily through the dark. She rode well, better than he'd realized, with the particular combination of firmness and patience that cattle respond to when they're anxious, and she was everywhere at once, cutting off breakaways, pushing the stragglers, moving the whole scattered mass back toward the gap in the fence and through it. There were 3 men waiting on the northern edge of the pasture. He saw them when his lantern caught the metal of a bridle. 3 riders sitting their horses in the dark at the boundary of Voss's land, watching. He rode toward them. He didn't pull his rifle. He didn't reach for his pistol. He just rode straight at them with the lantern in his left hand, closing the distance until he was close enough to see their faces. Hard-looking men, hired hands, the kind of men who do unpleasant work for wages and don't ask questions about whose interests they're serving. He stopped his horse 10 feet from them and said nothing for a moment, just held the lantern up and looked at each of them in turn. "You cut my fence," he said. None of them answered. The one in the middle, slightly older, probably whoever was in charge of this particular job, had the kind of face that had practiced being expressionless as a professional skill. "My cattle are going back through that gap right now," Silas said. "And first thing tomorrow morning, I'm going to be in Caldwell Crossing at the sheriff's office with a written account of this night. I have a boundary survey filed with the state land office in Austin. This land is on record as belonging to this ranch." He let that settle for a moment, then added, "You can tell Mr. Voss that the next time someone cuts my fence, I won't be riding out here alone." The middleman looked at him. He looked at Evelyn, who had appeared at Silas's right side on her horse without Silas hearing her approach. "You're going to have bigger problems than a fence tonight," the man said, nodding north. "Yes," Silas said. We all are. I suggest you ride home. Another moment of stillness. Then the middleman pulled his horse around and the other two followed, and they rode north into the dark and didn't look back. Silas exhaled slowly. He hadn't been as calm as he'd appeared. The inside of his chest had been doing something considerably less steady than his voice. You were bluffing, Evelyn said beside him, about not being alone. Partly, he said. Partly. The filing wasn't a bluff. She looked at him for a moment, then turned her horse back toward the herd. Help me get the last of them through. They got the last of the cattle through the gap at 4:15 in the morning. Silas counted heads by lantern. 61 of 62. And the missing one he found 20 minutes later standing alone in the northeast corner of the pasture, a young steer who seemed genuinely confused about everything that was happening, which Silas felt was a reasonable response. He drove the steer back through, and then he and Evelyn lashed the gap in the fence closed with whatever they could find in the dark. Spare wire, rope, 2 posts they dragged from the supply near the barn. It wouldn't hold in a serious wind, but it would hold long enough for what was coming, and what was coming was no longer theoretical. The storm hit at 5:40 in the morning. They were both in the barn when it arrived. They had been working side by side for the past 20 minutes, getting the horses into their stalls and securing everything that could become a projectile or a hazard in high wind. Silas was tying off the barn door from the inside when the sound that had been building in the north for the past 2 hours arrived all at once, not gradually but completely, like someone had thrown open a door the size of the sky. The temperature outside dropped 15 degrees in 30 minutes. The wind hit the barn at a speed that made the whole structure shudder and moan, and through the gaps in the boards came a driving sleet that quickly turned to snow. Heavy, wet snow moving nearly horizontal, the kind that doesn't fall so much as a tack. They were stuck in the barn. Evelyn sat on a hay bale and pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the barn walls shaking. Silas sat across from her. The horses shifted in their stalls. The early calves, in their corner pen, pressed close to each other and made small sounds. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. The lantern between them threw a small, uncertain light. Outside, the storm announced itself with a sound like the world being torn along a seam, and in here it was cold. Not mortally cold, not yet, but cold enough that their breath came in visible clouds, and sitting still would eventually become a problem. Silas got up and found a second lantern, lit it from the first, and hung them both high where their heat would do the most good. He located 2 saddle blankets in the tack room and handed her one. He pulled a section of loose hay down from the loft. Not to use for heat. There was no safe way to burn hay in a barn, but to sit on, which provided some insulation from the cold ground. She took the blanket and watched him work. You were scared, she said. Out there with those men. He sat back down on the hay. Yes. You didn't show it. Showing it wouldn't have helped. She considered that. The wind hit the barn again, and a sound like a whip crack ran through one of the upper beams. A flexion, not a failure, but a reminder of what was happening outside. I was scared too, she said. When I lost sight of you out there. In the dark. He looked at her across the lantern light. The admission cost her something. He could see that clearly. Evelyn Mercer did not give away what things cost her, as a general rule. She paid the price and kept her face neutral and got on with it. And the fact that she was telling him this, in a cold barn at 5 in the morning after the hardest night either of them had had on this property, meant something. I know, he said quietly. You couldn't have known that. I know because I lost sight of you too, he said. And I know what it felt like. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. The storm pressed against the barn walls with a kind of relentless, mindless force. And in the small circle of light between them, something shifted again. Not dramatically, because neither of them was the dramatic kind. Just a quiet realignment, the way land settles after a hard rain, finding a new stable position that turns out to be better than the one before. The filing in Austin, she said eventually, pulling the conversation back to solid ground, because that was what she did when she needed to. Even with the storm, even with what happened tonight, Voss can't undo a state land office filing. No, Silas said. He can't. His men cutting the fence that could actually help us. Evidence of interference with a recorded boundary. That's what I was thinking. You were thinking that while you were riding at 3 men in the dark. I was thinking several things. The corner of her mouth moved. That almost smile he'd been catching glimpses of since October. The one she didn't quite give him all the way yet. The one he'd stopped trying not to look for. We should sleep if we can, she said. It'll be light in a few hours. If the worst of it passes by midday, we'll need to check the herd and get out to the property lines. I know. They rearranged the hay bales into something that could charitably be called accommodation, wrapped themselves in their blankets, and the barn settled into its own sounds. The horses breathing, the calves shifting, the storm doing what it was going to do regardless of anyone's plans or papers or fence lines. Silas lay on his back and stared up at the dark rafters and listened to the storm work. He thought about the men on horses in the dark, and the one in the middle with the expressionless face and the calm certainty that they would lose, which had been radiating off him like heat even as he turned and rode away. He thought about Voss somewhere warm and dry tonight, waiting to hear how it had gone, calculating whether this play had put the land within his reach at last. He thought about Evelyn saying, "I was scared too, when I lost sight of you," and what it had taken for her to say that, and what it meant that she had said it anyway. Across the barn, her breathing had slowed and steadied. She was asleep, the sleep of someone who has burned through everything they had and has nothing left to hold consciousness in place. It was the most unguarded he had ever seen her. He pulled his blanket tighter and closed his eyes and listened to the winter tear itself apart against the barn walls. And somewhere in that sound, in the fury of it, in the way this piece of land was taking everything the season had to throw at it and still standing, he felt something he hadn't felt in 11 ranches and 8 years on the road. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That feeling was unfamiliar enough that it kept him awake a little longer than he meant to, turning it over in his mind, making sure it was real, and not just exhaustion making things seem more significant than they were. It held up. Every time he checked it, it was still there. The storm raged. The barn stood. The cattle huddled together in the south pasture and leaned into the wind and survived, the way cattle do. The way things built to last always find a way to do when the people responsible for them refuse to let go. The storm lasted 4 days. Not the violence of that first night. Nothing quite matched those hours in the barn with the walls shaking and the sound of the sky coming apart. But the cold that followed was its own kind of punishment. The temperature didn't lift above 15 degrees for the better part of a week, and the snow that had fallen in the first 2 days crusted over into a hard shell that reflected the pale winter light and made every step across the yard an exercise in careful footing. The water in the secondary trough froze solid to the bottom. 2 of the fence posts on the north line heaved out of the ground when the soil expanded. The chimney on the main house developed a draft problem that filled the kitchen with smoke until Silas climbed up on the ice-slicked roof in 20-degree cold and cleared a bird's nest from the upper flue that had no business being there in January. He did all of this without being asked, not because he was trying to demonstrate something, but because the work needed doing, and he was there, and that was the whole of his reasoning. That had always been the whole of his reasoning about work. It was either there or it wasn't, and if it was there, you did it. What was different now was that for the first time in his life, the work felt like it belonged to him. Not the legal sense of ownership, though that was part of it. More the sense that what he was repairing and protecting and holding together through the worst of this winter was something he would still care about when spring came, and the spring after that, and the one after that. The 11 ranches before this one had all been other people's things. He'd maintained them well because he took pride in doing a job right, but he'd never lain awake at night worried about someone else's fence line or felt the cold in his chest when a calf wasn't thriving. He lay awake worrying about those things now. On the 3rd morning after the storm, he found the first calf down. It was the smaller of the 2 early births they'd been watching, a heifer calf, black with a white patch on her left shoulder, born 4 weeks premature and never quite as strong as she should have been. She was on her side in the corner of her pen in the barn, her breathing shallow and fast, her eyes showing too much white. He went to the house immediately. Evelyn was at the stove and turned when he came in, and she read his face before he said anything. "Which one?" "The heifer. She's down hard." Evelyn pulled her coat off the hook beside the door without stopping to think about it. They went to the barn together, and she crouched beside the calf and put her hands on the animal's neck and flanks, feeling the temperature, checking the muscle response, doing the rapid assessment of someone who'd been around livestock her whole life and knew what she was looking for. Her temperature's dropped, Evelyn said. We need to get her warm, not slowly, now. The house, Silas said. She looked up at him. Kitchen floor near the stove, he said. It's the warmest place we've got. There was a brief pause, not reluctance exactly, more the half-second recalibration of a practical person absorbing an idea that was unusual but sound. Get the door, she said. They carried the calf between them across the frozen yard and through the kitchen door, which was not a dignified process for anyone involved, including the calf, who managed a weak kick that caught Silas in the ribs as they maneuvered her through the frame. They laid her on a bed of burlap sacks near the stove, and Evelyn immediately began working, warming water, preparing a drench, talking to the animal in a low, steady voice that was different from the voice she used with people. Softer, less defended. Silas fed the stove until the kitchen was uncomfortably warm by any human standard and approximately right for a hypothermic calf. He made coffee because there was nothing else immediately useful he could do, and he set a cup beside Evelyn on the floor without comment. She didn't look up. Thank you. The calf's name, it turned out, was Mabel. Silas didn't know this until Evelyn used it while talking to the animal, and he filed it away without remarking on it. The fact that she'd named the calf, the fact that she said the name with a particular kind of helpless affection that she would never have directed at a person, or at least not yet. They sat on the kitchen floor with Mabel between them for 3 hours. Evelyn administered the drench in careful doses. Silas refilled the stove and kept coffee coming, and at some point found himself talking too, not to Evelyn, but to the calf, in the low, senseless murmur that you use with sick animals, because the sound matters more than the words. He was not a man who talked to animals as a general practice, and he was dimly aware that something about this particular winter had loosened things in him that had been set rigid for a long time. Around noon, Mabel lifted her head. It wasn't dramatic. She just raised her head off the burlap and looked at the two humans sitting on either side of her with the expression of complete indifference that calves default to when they're feeling well enough to be unimpressed by their circumstances. Evelyn sat back against the kitchen cabinet and exhaled. She'll make it, she said. Looks that way. She looked at the calf, then at the kitchen ceiling, then at Silas with a tiredness that had something almost like laughter threaded through it. I have a calf in my kitchen. You do. Robert would have thought this was completely ridiculous. Robert would have been right, Silas said, but she's alive. Evelyn laughed. Actually laughed, a short, unguarded sound she didn't seem to have planned. It lasted only a moment, and she pulled it back in, but it had been there, real and unmanaged, and it was the first time he'd heard it. He kept his expression neutral, but something in his chest did a thing he chose not to examine too closely. Mabel stayed in the kitchen for 2 more days. It was objectively inconvenient. She took up significant floor space, required attention at intervals, and had opinions about her situation that she expressed at volume in the early morning hours. Silas slept on a bedroll in the kitchen those 2 nights to manage the feeding schedule, which meant he was sleeping in the house for the first time since he'd arrived, which was a fact they both treated with the same careful ordinariness they brought to most things that were quietly significant. On the second night, past midnight, Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe. She had a blanket over her shoulders, and her hair was down. He'd never seen it down before. Always pulled back when she was working. Always put up when she was in public. It was longer than he'd realized. She looked younger somehow, less armored. She looked at Mabel, sleeping. She looked at Silas, sitting against the far cabinet with a cup of coffee he'd made an hour ago and hadn't finished. You should sleep, she said. I will. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and sat down on the other side of Mabel, pulling the blanket around her. She looked at the calf for a while. When I came here the first time, as Robert's wife, she said, I didn't know anything about cattle. I grew up in a house in Abilene. My father was a bookkeeper. She paused. Robert had to teach me everything. I was terrible at it for the first 2 years. I cried once because a calf died and I thought I'd done something wrong. And Robert sat on the barn floor with me for an hour, explaining that sometimes they just die, that it's not always something you did or didn't do. She looked down at Mabel. I've never let myself cry over a calf since then, but I've named every one of them. Silas listened without interrupting. He understood without being told that she was giving him something by saying this, not the facts of it, but the unguarded quality of it, the willingness to let him see a thing she kept private. Robert sounds like he was a patient man, Silas said. He was. More patient than I deserved, some years. She looked at the window, at the dark and cold beyond it. I wasn't easy when I was young. I had a temper. I still do. I've learned where to put it. A pause. He used to say I was the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and he meant it as a compliment, and I'm not entirely sure that's healthy, but it's what I come from. It's what saved this ranch, Silas said. She looked at him. We both know I couldn't have done this alone. Maybe, but you'd held it together for 14 months before I walked up your fence line. On your own, against Voss, against the bank, against... He gestured vaguely at the winter outside. All of this. Most people would have sold and moved on. I'm not most people. No, he said. You're not. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, back at Mabel, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove and the calf's steady breathing and the wind working itself against the north wall of the house. Why didn't you keep your wages? She asked. The question came without warning. He stayed still for a second, recalculating. What makes you think I didn't? Because I do the books, she said simply. You've drawn wages from this ranch since November. I can see what's come in and what's gone out, and what's gone out in your name has been fence wire and replacement tools and the farrier and the feed supplement for the calves. She looked at him directly. You haven't kept $1 for yourself. He didn't say anything for a moment. He'd known she would figure it out eventually. She was too careful with the numbers for it to stay hidden long. He just hadn't decided what to say when she did. The debt comes due in March, he said finally. Silas, the bank isn't going to care what season it is. If the payment is short, they have standing to move on the property. He turned the cold coffee cup in his hand. I did the math in November. If I put my wages toward the balance through February, we close the gap enough that the spring cattle sales cover the rest. Without that, we're still short, and we're having a different conversation in March. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Her expression went through several things he couldn't quite name. Something that might have been argument, something that might have been the recognition that he was right about the math, something underneath both of those that was harder to identify. You should have told me, she said. I know. He met her eyes. I keep making that mistake. Yes, she said. You do. But her voice had something in it that was different from the last time she'd said those words to him. Less correction, more something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. I'll tell you from here on, he said. She nodded once. Then she looked back at Mabel, and something settled in the room, the way things settle when two people have just moved past a point they can't come back from, and both of them know it, and neither of them is sure yet what lies on the other side. January became February. The cold didn't relent. It was the worst winter anyone in the county could remember, the kind that gets a name attached to it in the local memory and becomes the thing people measure other hard winters against for the next 20 years. The winter of '86, people would call it later, and those who lived through it in this part of Texas would nod with the particular expression of people who survived something they weren't certain they would. Neighboring operations began to show the strain in February. Old Casper Dills lost his barn roof in the second major storm that came through in late January and couldn't afford to replace it, which meant his remaining cattle were exposed to the worst of the weather for 2 weeks before he finally sold the herd at a loss and boarded up his house. The Hargrove brothers, who ran 400 head on the land west of Caldwell Crossing, lost a third of their cattle to the cold and the feed shortage that came from roads being impassable for 2 weeks straight. Voss's operation, from what filtered back through town, was not unscathed. The running V was large enough to absorb losses that would have destroyed smaller outfits, but he'd lost significant numbers, and at least one of his line riders had quit in February, rather than work in conditions that were brutal even by the standards of men accustomed to brutal work. At the Mercer Ranch, At their ranch, as Silas had fully stopped qualifying it in his own mind, things were hard, but holding. They rationed the hay supply with surgical precision, giving each animal exactly what it needed and not more, adjusting daily based on temperature and each animal's condition. They repaired the frozen water line to the north trough, with materials Silas had the foresight to stockpile in October. They brought 3 more calves into the barn during the worst cold snaps. Not into the kitchen this time, Mabel having returned to the barn in late January, but into the enclosed tack room which held heat better than the main barn floor. Evelyn handled the books every night after supper, tracking every expense against every asset with the focused intensity of someone who understood that numbers were not abstract things, but representations of survival. Silas sat across from her sometimes, and they'd work through the calculations together. Hay cost versus cattle weight gain, projected spring market prices, what the debt balance would look like on March 15th if the weather broke by the first week of March and the roads opened in time for a sale. "We're going to make it," she said one evening in mid-February, looking at the numbers spread across the table. She didn't say it with relief or triumph. She said it the way she said most things, level, matter of fact, but underneath the levelness was something that had been coiled tight for a very long time and was only now beginning to loosen. "We're going to make it," Silas agreed. She looked up from the ledger. "You never doubted it." "I doubted it in December," he said honestly. "Before Pruitt's report, before we moved the fence line. I looked at the numbers and I thought we might be fighting on too many fronts at once. But not after. After," he considered it, "after we had the survey and the filing and the fence where it belongs, the only enemy left was the weather. And weather ends." She looked at him for a moment. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, it's just limited. Weather's a problem with an end built into it. Voss was a problem that could keep inventing new versions of itself." He paused. "I can work with problems that have a season." She smiled at that. Not the almost smile he'd been catching glimpses of for months, but a real one. Brief, quiet, turned slightly down at the corners, as if she wasn't entirely sure it was appropriate, but genuinely there. He felt it like a change in air pressure. The letter from the Austin Land Office arrived on February 20th, carried by a mail rider who'd made the trip from Caldwell Crossing despite roads that were still half frozen and unpleasant. Silas brought it in from the mailbox at the end of the lane and stood at the kitchen door and looked at the seal on the envelope for a moment before he brought it inside. Evelyn was at the stove. She turned when he came in, saw the envelope, and went still. He handed it to her. This was hers. Whatever was in it, the opening of it belonged to her. She broke the seal and read it standing at the kitchen counter, and he watched her face. Claude's response was interrupted. He watched her face the way you watch a sky that's been threatening weather for months, waiting for the thing that finally breaks one way or the other. She read the letter once. Then she set it flat on the counter with both hands, the way she'd set Pruitt's report on the kitchen table back in December. That gesture of hers that meant, this is real, and I am making myself believe it. She stood with her back to him for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. When she turned around, her eyes were bright. Not tears. He'd never seen her cry, and he had the sense that she'd made some private agreement with herself about that a long time ago. Just brightness. The particular kind that comes from something held under pressure for too long, finally finding a way out. "It's confirmed," she said. "The eastern boundary is recorded as corrected in the state land registry. The original 1871 federal grant line is reinstated." She paused. "It's ours, legally, finally, completely." Silas nodded. He didn't whoop or pound the table. That wasn't his way, and she would have found it strange if he had. He just stood there in the kitchen and let the weight of it settle. 91 acres of justice, years of Robert's careful notes, 3 days of frozen fence work, 1 night of confrontation in the dark, months of paperwork and waiting, all of it arriving here in a government envelope on a February morning while the last of the winter held its cold position outside. "We should notify the sheriff's office," he said, "about the fence cutting in January. We have the filing date now. If Voss wants to argue about it, he's arguing against the state of Texas." "I already wrote that letter," she said, 2 weeks ago. I was just waiting for this before I sent it." He looked at her. Of course she had. Of course you did, he said. She almost smiled. I learned it from someone who doesn't tell me things until they're ready. That's fair. She folded the letter carefully and put it with Pruitt's report and Robert's 1879 ledger. That shelf above the fireplace had become a kind of archive of everything they'd fought for and won, the physical record of a battle that had been won quietly, without guns or drama, mostly with patience and paperwork and the willingness to get back up every morning and do the work, regardless of how the previous day had ended. The letter to the sheriff went out that afternoon. 2 days later, Sheriff Alderton, a broad, slow-moving man who nonetheless had a reputation for taking his authority seriously when he chose to apply it, rode out to the Running V for what he described to people in town afterward as a courtesy visit with some questions about fence line activity in January. What was said in that conversation never made it into public record, but what followed it did. Within a week, Voss's lawyer filed a formal withdrawal of any and all claims against the eastern pasture of the Mercer property, citing a review of survey documentation. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology, just the legal machinery quietly dismantling itself the way it does when the man driving it has decided the cost of continuing outweighs the potential gain. Silas heard about the withdrawal from the feed store man on his next supply run, delivered in the same conversational tone as local weather information, because in Caldwell Crossing, land disputes were weather. They arrived, they caused damage, they eventually passed. He bought his supplies, tied the pack horse, and rode back to the ranch without stopping to celebrate in any visible way. He told Evelyn when he got home, standing in the barn while he unsaddled. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He didn't do it because he's a decent man. He did it because the math changed." "Yes," Silas said. "He'll look for another angle eventually, with someone else's land. Probably. But not ours." "Not ours," he agreed. She took the saddle from him and hung it without being asked, which was something she'd been doing more often lately. The small, unremarked sharing of tasks that happens between people who have stopped keeping careful account of whose job is whose. He noticed it the same way he'd noticed all the other small shifts over these months, without drawing attention to them, just registering that they were real. March arrived with a grudging warmth. Not spring exactly, more like winter loosening its grip finger by finger, reluctant, the way cold always is when it's been in charge for a long time. The snow began pulling back from the southern slopes first, then the flat ground, leaving behind mud and exposed dead grass and the general wreckage of a hard season, which on a working ranch means several weeks of repair and recovery work before anything can be called right again. They drove the cattle to the sale in Abilene on March 12th, 3 days ahead of the bank deadline. It wasn't a large sale, 40 head, all the mature stock they could spare without cutting into the breeding core of the herd, but the market had recovered from the worst of the winter panic, and the price per head was better than either of them had expected. The debt payment was made on March 14th. Not in full, they had not paid the entire balance, but enough to cover the due portion with a structured agreement for the remainder, the kind of agreement a bank extends to borrowers who demonstrate they intend to pay and have the assets to back that intention. The bank manager in Haskell, a thin man named Carver, who had the pinched look of someone perpetually dissatisfied with the amount of money he was looking at, reviewed their figures, reviewed the land registry confirmation, reviewed Silas's wage records, and offered the extension with the minimum of warmth legally required for the transaction. On the ride home, Evelyn said, "He expected us to fail." Most people did. "Does that bother you?" Silas thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I've spent most of my life being someone people didn't expect much from. You get used to it, and then sometimes you get to show them the math was wrong." She rode beside him in the early March light, the horses moving easily on a road that had dried enough to be pleasant. The country around them was starting to show the first tentative color, green at the roots of the dead grass, red buds on the brush along the creek line, the sky a cleaner blue than it had been all winter. "You put all your wages into the ranch," she said, "for 4 months. I know, I was there. You could have left in October with honest work behind you and wages in your pocket and a story about a strange woman who offered you the strangest job you'd ever been offered." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Why didn't you?" It was the question he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. He'd had versions of an answer assembled in the back of his mind for weeks now. Practical versions, logical versions, the kind of answer that wouldn't require either of them to step too far out onto uncertain ground. He let those versions go. Because it stopped feeling like a job, he said. She didn't answer immediately. The horses walked. A meadowlark started up somewhere to the left and then stopped. When? She asked. He considered the question. The night we rode into the dark together to get the cattle. I think that was when I stopped being able to pretend it was just a job. She nodded slowly, like that matched something she'd been working out for herself. I have something to tell you, he said. All right. I don't want the marriage we agreed to in October. He felt her go still beside him, though neither of them stopped riding. Not because it's failed, because it hasn't. What we agreed to in October is exactly what we have. The paperwork, the arrangement, the practical shape of a thing built for a specific purpose. He paused. But I want more than what we agreed to. I want what we actually have. She turned to look at him. Her expression was careful, as it always was when something mattered to her, the measured quality of a person who has been surprised before and learned to verify before she believes. What do we actually have? She asked. He held her gaze. I think you know. I want to hear you say it. We have a home, he said. Not a contract and a piece of land. A home. Built out of a hard winter and a dead man's notes and a calf on a kitchen floor and a lot of cold mornings where neither of us quit. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking for a renegotiation. I'm not asking for a new agreement. I'm telling you that somewhere between October and now, I stopped being a man who happened to be married to you and started being your husband. And I don't know what to do with that except say it out loud and let you decide what it means. The road ran straight ahead of them, empty, the March light flat and honest across the open country. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked forward, and her voice when she spoke was quieter than usual, the way she got when something had moved her and she was trying to stay composed out of long habit. When Pruitt left in December, she said, and you were walking back to the bunkhouse, I stood at the door and watched you go. A pause. I'd watched you walk back to that bunkhouse every night since October, and I'd never minded it. That night, I minded it. She was quiet for a beat. I didn't know what to do with that either, so I went to bed and told myself it was just the relief about the survey. Was it? No, she said. It was not. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was something in his chest that had been building since October, since the first night he'd walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark and seen the lamp go on in her kitchen window, and it had weight to it, but not the heavy kind. The kind of weight that ballast gives a ship, the kind that means you're stable instead of scattered. Then we're saying the same thing, he said. We are, she said. All right, she echoed, and the corner of her mouth moved in that way it did when something was genuinely funny to her, but she wasn't ready to commit to a full smile. And he had been watching for that expression for 6 months, and it still did what it always did to his composure. They rode the rest of the way home without resolving every question, because the truth is that some things don't get resolved in a single conversation, especially between two private people who have both spent most of their lives keeping their own counsel. What they had was an understanding, and for now that was the right size of thing. Spring came in properly through April. The grass came back on the eastern pasture first, all 91 acres of it, greening up as if it had been waiting for permission, and maybe in some sense it had. The herd moved through it in the mild afternoons, working the new growth, putting weight back on that the winter had taken. The calves that had survived the hard months were strong, not without scars. The black heifer Mabel carried a slightly stiff left shoulder from her early days in the cold, and 2 of the older steers had lost ear tissue to frostbite. But alive and growing, and that was the whole of what mattered. Silas rebuilt the north fence line properly in April, replacing the heaved posts with new ones set deeper than standard, the kind of work that was more than the moment required and less than the future deserved. He repaired the barn roof, replaced the cracked water trough, fixed the chimney flue properly rather than the temporary fix he'd done in January. He made a list in October of everything the ranch needed, and he worked through it systematically, Not rushing, not cutting corners, doing the kind of thorough work that makes a thing last. Evelyn ordered 2 new breeding bulls from a stockman in Fort Worth in April, funded by the spring sale proceeds and the money freed up by the debt restructuring. The purchase was carefully researched. She had written to 3 different sources and compared bloodlines and prices before deciding, which was the way she did everything. And the bulls arrived in May looking exactly as advertised, which in Silas's experience was unusual enough to be remarked upon. He remarked upon it. She told him she'd been very specific in her correspondence about what she would accept and what she wouldn't, which he believed entirely. The letter from Voss came in late April. Not through a lawyer this time, and not a threat. Just a plain envelope addressed to them both, containing a single sheet in a formal hand that Silas recognized as someone who dictated it rather than written it themselves. Mr. and Mrs. Boone, it read. I write to advise that the Running V will not be pursuing any further interest in the matter of the eastern boundary. We have concluded that the resources required exceed the potential benefit. I trust this clarifies our position going forward. No signature beyond the Running V letterhead. No acknowledgement of what his men had done in January. No apology for 2 years of legal harassment against a woman he'd assumed he could outlast. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and set it down. That's all he's going to give us, she said. That's all he has to give, Silas said. The rest he keeps. She looked at the letter for a moment. Robert would have wanted an apology. Robert deserved one. He's not going to get it. She picked the letter up and folded it once and set it aside. Not on the shelf above the fireplace with the documents that mattered, just on the edge of the table to be dealt with later. A filing rather than a keeping. But he won, she said quietly. Robert won, even if he didn't live to see it. Silas nodded. There wasn't much to add to that, so he didn't add anything. They drove Mabel to the south pasture on the first warm day of May, which was a more sentimental act than either of them would have admitted to anyone in Caldwell Crossing. The heifer had been in the barn all winter and was ready for open ground, and she walked out the gate and stopped and looked at the grass spread out before her with what Silas privately thought was the expression of someone who hadn't been outside in too long. Go on, Evelyn said. Mabel went. They stood at the gate and watched her go, and the morning light was coming in low from the east across the pasture, and the grass was green in a way that Texas grass only gets in May, a color that seems almost unreasonable after a hard winter, too vivid to be real. The herd was moving in the distance, and the 2 new bulls were doing what bulls were purchased to do, and somewhere along the creek line the cottonwoods had leafed out fully overnight the way they do every spring, present, then suddenly everywhere. I have something to tell you, Evelyn said. He waited. I knew, she said. By December, maybe earlier. She kept her eyes on the pasture. I knew it wasn't the arrangement anymore. She stopped. I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was changing the terms on you, like I was asking for something you hadn't signed up for. You weren't. I know that now. You knew it then too, he said. You were just being careful. She turned to look at him. I'm always careful. I know. I don't mind it. He held her gaze. I'm not going anywhere, Evelyn. She was quiet for a moment. The morning moved around them. Warm air, the sound of the cattle, a red-tailed hawk working a thermal somewhere above the south ridge. I know you're not, she said. And the way she said it, not as reassurance-seeking, but as a fact she had verified to her own satisfaction, a thing she had decided was true and was now stating for the record, landed on him the way all her plain statements landed, with a weight that other people's elaborate declarations never quite achieved. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the gatepost. She let him. They stood there like that for a while, not saying much, watching the ranch do what a ranch does on a good morning in May. It wasn't a triumphant moment in the way stories sometimes manufacture them. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, no clean line marking what they'd been before and what they were now. Just 2 people standing at a fence gate in the early morning, hand in hand, looking at something they'd built together out of debt and drought and legal paperwork and a January blizzard and a calf on the kitchen floor. In town, the story of what had happened at the Mercer place over the winter had already taken on the particular shape that frontier communities give to stories they need. A shape that's partly true and partly wish fulfillment, the way all good stories become. People talked about the woman who'd held the land against a powerful man, and the drifting cowboy she'd married on a practical basis who turned out to be something else entirely. They talked about the survey and the blizzard and the confrontation in the dark and the cable sent to Austin that had changed the legal record. What they didn't talk about, because they didn't know, and some things don't belong to the town, was the kitchen at 3 in the morning with a sick calf between two people who were figuring out that what they were to each other didn't have a clean name in any contract they'd ever signed. Or the night in the barn when the storm was trying to take everything and neither of them left. Or the exact moment, sometime between October and May, when a practical arrangement between two private people became the most honest thing either of them had ever been part of. By summer, the ranch was carrying 80 head again. By fall, it would be more. By the following spring, it was known in the county, not by official announcement, but by the reliable transmission of small, observable facts, that the Boone operation had become one of the more solid concerns in that part of Texas. Not the largest, not the showiest, but the kind of place that visibly understood what it was doing, the kind of outfit whose cattle came to market in good condition year after year, whose fences were set right, whose land was well managed. People came to Silas with questions sometimes, about cattle, about land, about the kind of practical problems that ranching creates, and that experience eventually teaches you to solve. He answered when he could, and said he didn't know when he didn't, which was considered a virtue in a country that had seen too many men pretend to certainties they didn't have. People came to Evelyn with the harder questions, the legal ones, the financial ones, the ones about what to do when a powerful neighbor was making your life difficult and the law felt like it was written against you. She talked to them plainly and shared what she knew, and sometimes gave them the name of a surveyor in Abilene whose work she trusted. Clifton Voss died in 1889, 3 years later, of a heart condition that his doctor had apparently been warning him about for some time. The Running V was sold and broken up, pieces of it going to 4 different buyers. The land to the east of the Mercer Ranch, Boone Ranch as it had become, was purchased by a young family from Oklahoma who ran a few hundred sheep and kept to themselves and gave no one any trouble. The last entry in Robert Mercer's 1879 ledger had been made in October of that year, the same month the survey questions had stopped appearing in the pages. It read simply, "This land is worth fighting for. I hope someone does." Evelyn found that entry again in the spring. She'd been going back through the old volumes, thinking about what to do with them, whether to keep them as they were or whether the record they contained deserved a better home than a shelf above the fireplace. She read the entry and sat with it for a while at the kitchen table, the morning coming in through the east window, the sounds of the ranch carrying in from outside, Silas's voice in the yard, the cattle, the particular kind of active quiet that belongs to a working place that has found its right shape. She closed the ledger and set it on the table and looked at it. Then she picked up her own ledger, the current one, the 1887 volume she'd started in January, and opened it to that morning's page and began to record the day's numbers in her careful hand. Feed costs, cattle count, weather note, condition of the south pasture. And at the bottom of the entry, in smaller writing, below the practical record of a working day on a working ranch, she wrote, "Someone did." She put the pen down and looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she got up and went to the door and stepped out into the May morning, where the light was the particular clean gold of early hours and the grass ran green all the way to the eastern fence line, the right fence line, the honest one. And Silas was at the barn and turned when he heard her step on the porch boards and raised a hand without theatrics, the way you greet someone whose presence has become the expected and right thing, the thing that would be strange to do without. She raised her hand back. The ranch stretched out around them in all directions, alive and imperfect and theirs. Not because a document said so, though it did, and not because they'd survived a winter that had broken harder outfits than theirs, though they had, but because they had chosen it, each in their own way, separately and then together, and the choosing had turned out to be the thing that made it real. That's the whole of it. That's the story. Not a man who rode in and saved someone. Not a woman who needed saving. Two people who found each other at the precise moment each had something the other needed, and discovered, somewhere in the cold and the work and the honesty between them, that what they needed had quietly become something neither of them had known they were looking for. A place to belong, a person to belong with. The morning held them both in its ordinary light, and the day began.